Sweat slicked Samantha's palms as she wedged the heavy steel crowbar against a hidden, reinforced door deep within the decaying warehouse. For 3 weeks, she had survived on a moldy mattress in this freezing tomb, discarded like trash by her billionaire husband. With a deafening crack, the deadbolt finally snapped. As the iron door groaned open, a rush of sterile, climate-controlled air hit her face. Samantha aimed her flashlight into the void, and the beam caught a glimmer that made her heart stop. Hidden behind these crumbling walls wasn't just a secret, it was the lethal weapon she needed to dismantle the man who had stolen her life. The rain was coming down in sheets when Samantha Hayes pulled her 10-year-old Honda Civic into the sprawling, manicured driveway of her estate in the affluent suburbs of Weston, Massachusetts. After running errands all day in the city, all she wanted was a hot shower and a quiet evening with her husband of 10 years, Richard Sterling. Richard was a highly successful commercial real estate developer, a man known equally for his immense wealth and his ruthless business tactics. But to Samantha, he had always been just Richard, the charming, driven man she had supported back when he was working out of a cramped, one-bedroom apartment in South Boston. She jogged up the marble steps, shivering, and jammed her key into the front door. It wouldn't turn. Frowning, she tried again. The mechanism was entirely different. Before she could knock, the heavy oak door swung inward. Richard stood there, dressed in a crisp Brioni suit, his expression as cold and unyielding as the marble pillars flanking the entryway. He didn't step aside to let her in. Instead, he looked down at her with a chilling detachment that made the blood freeze in her veins. "Richard?" Samantha asked, confused, wiping the rain from her eyes. "The lock. I had it changed this morning," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. He stepped back slightly, and that was when Samantha saw her. Chloe Montgomery. She was Richard's 25-year-old executive assistant, a woman who had spent the last 2 years smiling sweetly at Samantha at company galas. Now, Chloe was wearing Samantha's silk robe, casually sipping chamomile tea from Samantha's favorite ceramic mug, standing in the foyer of Samantha's home. "What is going on?" Samantha's voice trembled, a sickening dread pooling in her stomach. "Your bags are by the side gate," Richard said smoothly, ignoring her question. "I've filed for divorce. The papers were sent to your attorney an hour ago. You are no longer welcome on this property." "Divorce? Bags?" Samantha grabbed the doorframe, dizzy. "Richard, you can't be serious. We've been married for a decade. I helped you build sterling equities. You can't just throw me out into the rain." "I can, and I have," Richard replied, his eyes narrowing. "And before you start demanding half of my empire, you should check your email. I invoked the infidelity clause in our prenuptial agreement." "Infidelity clause?" Samantha gasped. "I have never been unfaithful to you?" "The photographs say otherwise," Richard sneered. "My private investigator caught you at the Four Seasons with a man last week. It's all heavily documented. The prenup is ironclad, Samantha. You breached the morality clause. You get nothing. Not the house, not the bank accounts, not the investments. Nothing." The door slammed shut in her face. The heavy deadbolt clicked into place. Samantha stood in the freezing rain for what felt like hours. When she finally stumbled around to the side gate, she found 3 black trash bags sitting in a puddle. Inside were a few pairs of jeans, some sweaters, and her basic toiletries. Her designer clothes, her jewelry, even the necklace her late mother had given her, were gone. The next morning, sitting in the cramped office of her divorce attorney, Susan Gable, the full weight of her nightmare became a reality. Susan slid a manila folder across the desk. Inside were photographs of a woman who looked exactly like Samantha, walking into a hotel room with a man. "Susan, these are doctored," Samantha cried, pointing at the glossy prints. "Look at the lighting on the neck. It's a deep fake, or heavily photoshopped. I was at a charity luncheon that day. There were 200 witnesses." "I believe you, Sam," Susan said gently, her face lined with sympathy. "But proving it in court will take months, maybe years, of forensic digital analysis. Richard has frozen all of your joint assets. He's hired Peter Vance, the most aggressive divorce shark in Boston. Richard claims the joint accounts were funded entirely by his LLCs, and a judge granted an emergency injunction, freezing them until the trial. Do you have any separate accounts?" Samantha felt the room spinning, I have an old checking account from before we were married. I think there's about $3,000 in it. That won't even cover the retainer for the forensic experts, Susan sighed, rubbing her temples. Richard has legally and financially starved you out. He planned this meticulously. He manufactured a reason to trigger the prenup so he could leave you destitute and run off with his assistant. Samantha walked out of the law office with exactly $3,450 to her name, a trunk full of wet clothes, and nowhere to go. The man she had loved had not just broken her heart, he had erased her entire existence. 2 weeks later, the reality of poverty had sunken into Samantha's bones. The Boston winters were unforgiving, and living in a 2012 Honda Civic was a daily battle for survival. She spent her nights parked under the harsh fluorescent lights of a 24-hour Walmart parking lot, wrapping herself in every piece of clothing she owned, shivering until the sun came up. During the day, she washed her face in gas station bathrooms and scoured local coffee shop bulletin boards for any under-the-table work she could find. Her friends from the country club had vanished the moment Richard spun his narrative. In their elite circle, Richard was the golden goose. Samantha was just a disposable asset. Every time she reached out for a loan or a couch to sleep on, she was met with awkward excuses or unreturned calls. One bitterly cold Tuesday, while nursing a $1 cup of black coffee at a local diner in Lowell, Massachusetts, a gritty, post-industrial city 30 miles north of Boston, Samantha saw it. It was a crumpled, yellow municipal notice, pinned to a corkboard near the restrooms. City of Lowell. Delinquent tax foreclosure, auction commercial, and residential properties. All bids start at the cost of back taxes. Samantha stared at the flyer. She couldn't afford an apartment. First, last, and security deposits in the Boston area were upwards of $4,000, and her credit score was currently being pulverized by Richard's aggressive legal maneuvers. But maybe, just maybe, she could buy a cheap, derelict plot of land or a ruined shack just to have a legal place to park her car and eventually build something. The auction was being held that very morning at the Lowell City Hall. Samantha drove her battered Civic to the municipal building, her heart pounding. The auction room was filled with aggressive, sharp-eyed real estate investors, house flippers, and landlords. They wore cheap suits and carried thick binders, ruthlessly bidding against each other for multi-family homes and abandoned Victorian houses. Samantha sat in the back row, clutching her cashier's check for $3,000, feeling like a lamb in a room full of wolves. Property after property went for tens of thousands of dollars. Her hope began to dwindle. She was about to leave when the auctioneer, a tired-looking man with a thick Boston accent, clicked a slide on the projector. Next up is Lot 442, located at 1089 Middlesex Street. It's an abandoned commercial warehouse on the outskirts of the industrial park. Property has been vacant for nearly 8 years. No utilities currently active. Roof is reported to be in severe disrepair. Environmental liability is unknown, as it was previously a textile dye storage facility. Starting bid is the amount of back taxes owed, $2,500. The room went dead silent. The investors flipped through their binders, shaking their heads. Environmental liability were the two scariest words in real estate. It meant if the soil was contaminated with toxic chemicals, the new owner would be on the hook for millions in EPA cleanup costs. No one wanted a useless, toxic, collapsing brick box. "Do I have $2,500? The auctioneer droned, looking around the room. "Any takers for $2,500? Going once?" Samantha looked at the grainy photo on the projector screen. It was a massive, ugly, red brick structure covered in ivy and graffiti, surrounded by a chain-link fence. It looked terrifying. It looked like a nightmare, but it had 4 walls and a roof. It was a shelter. Her hand shot up before her brain could stop it. The auctioneer blinked, surprised, peering over his glasses at the disheveled woman in the back row. "I have a bid for $2,500. Do I hear 3,000? Anyone?" The men in the room turned to look at her, a few chuckling under their breath at the poor woman buying a toxic money pit. Going twice. Sold. To the lady in the back. An hour later, Samantha walked out of City Hall, holding a manila envelope containing a quitclaim deed. She had $950 left in the world, but she owned a building, She owned something Richard couldn't touch. The drive to Middlesex Street took 20 minutes. The warehouse was nestled at the dead end of a cracked asphalt road, bordered by overgrown weeds and a rusted railway line. Next door was a loud, chaotic auto scrapyard surrounded by corrugated metal fencing. Samantha unlocked the heavy chain on the front gate and pushed it open. She pulled her Civic right up to the massive, rolling bay doors. She found a side entrance, a heavy steel door hanging slightly off its hinges, and pushed her way inside. The smell of mildew, old oil, and stagnant air hit her like a physical blow. The interior was cavernous, stretching back into the gloom. Sunlight filtered through broken skylights, illuminating thousands of dust motes dancing in the cold air. The floor was littered with debris, shattered wooden pallets, rusted barrels, old tires, and mountains of rotting cardboard boxes. "Well," Samantha whispered to herself, the echo bouncing off the brick walls. "It's home." As she walked back outside to grab her sleeping bag, a gruff voice called out, "Hey, you lost?" Samantha jumped. Standing by the chain-link fence was a burly man in his 60s, wearing grease-stained overalls and a thick scowl. "No," Samantha said, standing a little taller. "I'm the new owner." The man's eyebrows shot up. "You? Bought this dump? Jesus, lady, I hope you didn't pay more than a nickel." "I'm Tom Baxter. I own the scrapyard next door." "Samantha Hayes," she replied, walking over to shake his calloused hand. Tom looked her up and down, noting her exhausted eyes and the sleeping bag in her arms. His scowl softened just a fraction. "Place has been empty since I moved in 5 years ago. Rumor is some big corporate suit bought it out of bankruptcy, never did anything with it, and forgot to pay the city taxes. You're gonna need a lot of bleach, kid, and a baseball bat. The raccoons in there are the size of golden retrievers." "I'll keep that in mind," Samantha managed a tired smile. "Thanks, Tom." That night, Samantha swept a small corner of a raised concrete platform in the back of the warehouse, set up her sleeping bag, and lit a camping lantern. As the wind howled outside, rattling the corrugated metal roof, she pulled her coat tight around her. She was terrified, freezing, and exhausted, but as she looked around the massive, shadowy space, a tiny spark of determination ignited in her chest. Richard had taken her past, but he wouldn't take her future. She was going to survive. The first 2 weeks in the warehouse were brutal. Samantha threw herself into manual labor, treating the massive cleanup like a full-time job. It kept her warm, and more importantly, it kept her from thinking about Richard and Chloe living in her beautiful home. Tom Baxter proved to be an unexpected guardian angel. Seeing her hauling debris entirely by herself, he occasionally wandered over with his forklift to help her move the heavier rusted textile machinery out to the dumpster she had rented with her last few $100s. He also let her run a heavy-duty extension cord from his scrapyard office to her warehouse, giving her enough electricity to power a space heater, a mini-fridge, and some floodlights. By the third week, the main floor of the warehouse was mostly cleared. It was a massive, open space, roughly 10,000 square feet. With the garbage gone, Samantha finally began to properly inspect the structure of her new property. She needed to figure out if she could partition a small area to create a livable studio apartment and perhaps lease the rest of the space to local mechanics or artists to generate an income. With a tape measure and a notebook, Samantha started mapping the interior. She measured the length of the right wall, jotting down the numbers. Then, she walked outside and measured the exterior of the same wall. She frowned, looking at her notebook. Exterior length, 150 feet. Interior length, 120 feet. "That can't be right," she muttered. She walked back inside and measured again. 120 feet. She checked the back wall. Exterior width, 100 feet. Interior width, 100 feet. The math was glaringly obvious. There was a 30-foot discrepancy at the back of the building. A massive chunk of square footage was completely unaccounted for. Samantha walked to the back of the warehouse. The rear wall was made of the same distressed red brick as the rest of the interior, but as she stood under the harsh glare of her halogen floodlight, she noticed something odd. The rest of the warehouse was held up by massive, rusted steel I-beams. but along this back wall, the beams disappeared directly into the brickwork. Furthermore, the mortar between the bricks on this specific wall looked ever so slightly cleaner, slightly newer than the crumbling 1920s mortar of the side walls. It was a false wall. Samantha's pulse quickened. Why would someone build a false wall to seal off 30 feet of an abandoned warehouse? Environmental hazards? Was there a toxic spill back there they were trying to hide from inspectors? A shiver of panic ran down her spine. If it was an asbestos dump or chemical waste, she was completely ruined. She walked over to Tom's scrapyard. "Tom, do you have a sledgehammer I can borrow?" Tom looked up from the carburetor he was tinkering with. "Sure. What's you breaking?" "I'm not sure yet," Samantha said truthfully. Armed with a heavy 20-pound sledgehammer, Samantha stood before the false brick wall. She took a deep breath, raised the heavy hammer over her shoulder, and swung with all her might. Clang! The hammer bounced back violently, sending a shockwave up her arms that rattled her teeth. Samantha stumbled backward, dropping the hammer, grasping her stinging hands. She walked up to the wall and inspected the point of impact. The brick had shattered, falling away in dusty red chunks. But behind the brick wasn't darkness, or insulation, or toxic waste. It was solid, reinforced steel. Someone had built a high-security steel partition and disguised it with a layer of fake brick veneer. Adrenaline flooded Samantha's system. She ran her hands along the wall, searching frantically for a seam, a door, anything. She moved a stack of leftover wooden pallets near the left corner, and there it was, a heavy, industrial steel door, painted black to blend into the shadows. And securing it was a state-of-the-art electronic keypad deadbolt, accompanied by a massive padlock made of hardened boron alloy. This wasn't an abandoned textile dump. Someone was actively protecting something inside. Samantha raced to the front of the warehouse and grabbed the heavy steel crowbar she used for prying up rotted floorboards. She sprinted back to the door. Her hands were sweating, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She wedged the crowbar behind the heavy padlock's mounting bracket, planted her boots against the steel door, and pulled with every ounce of strength she had in her body. Her muscles screamed. The metal groaned. She thought of Richard's cold eyes. She thought of the fake photographs. She thought of Chloe wearing her clothes. A surge of pure, unadulterated fury gave her a burst of superhuman strength. With a deafening crack, the rusted screws of the mounting bracket ripped free from the steel door. The heavy padlock clattered to the concrete floor. The door groaned open an inch, releasing a rush of stale, perfectly climate-controlled air. Samantha pushed the door wide open and shined her flashlight into the pitch-black void. Her beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the space, and she gasped, her hands shaking so violently she dropped the light. The hidden room was massive, spotless, and lined with industrial shelving units. But it wasn't the shelving that made her fall to her knees in shock. Parked in the center of the room, gleaming flawlessly under the beam of her fallen flashlight, was a pristine, vintage 1962 Ferrari 250 GTO, a car she recognized instantly because Richard had a framed photograph of that exact model in his home office, always bragging that it was the white whale of collectors, worth north of $40 million. But that wasn't all. Stacked on the pallets next to the car were dozens of heavy, lockable Pelican cases. One of the cases had popped open over the years, its contents spilling slightly onto the pristine epoxy floor. Samantha crawled forward and picked up the item resting on the floor. It was a heavy, solid bar of gold, stamped with a Swiss refinery logo. And right next to it, resting on a folding table, was a stack of leather-bound ledgers. Samantha reached out with trembling hands and flipped open the top ledger. The pages were filled with handwritten accounts, offshore routing numbers, and transfer dates. At the bottom of every single page was a signature she would know anywhere. The sharp, aggressive cursive of her ex-husband, Richard Sterling. The warehouse hadn't been bought by a random corporation. It had been bought by one of Richard's untraceable shell companies to stash his illicit, hidden wealth assets he had illegally kept hidden from the IRS, from the government, and from his divorce proceedings. And through a miraculous twist of bureaucratic incompetence and unpaid municipal taxes, Richard's multi-million-dollar secret vault had been legally sold at auction. To her, a slow, dangerous smile spread across Samantha's face as the shadows of the warehouse wrapped around her. Richard had thrown her out to the wolves, completely unaware that she had just legally purchased the keys to his absolute destruction. For 3 days, Samantha didn't sleep. She barely ate. She functioned on pure adrenaline, black coffee, and the terrifying realization of what she possessed. The hidden vault was a masterclass in criminal paranoia. After carefully documenting every inch of the room with her cracked smartphone camera, Samantha began to inventory the contents. There were 42 Pelican cases. 30 contained solid gold bullion unmarked, untraceable, and heavy enough to break a man's foot if dropped. 8 cases held bundles of $100 bills, vacuum-sealed in thick plastic, smelling faintly of old ink and machine oil. The last 4 cases were filled with bearer bonds and deeds to offshore properties in the Cayman Islands and Belize. And then there were the ledgers. Samantha sat on a rusted folding chair under the glare of her camping lantern, poring over the leather-bound books. She wasn't an accountant, but she had spent 10 years listening to Richard talk business over dinner. It didn't take a genius to understand what she was looking at. Richard had been running a massive double-book operation. He was inflating the construction costs of his commercial real estate projects, skimming millions off the top from his investors, and laundering the stolen capital through a labyrinth of shell companies to avoid the IRS. But how had he lost the warehouse? How could a man so meticulous make such a catastrophic error? She found the answer tucked inside the front cover of the most recent ledger, a stack of municipal tax bills addressed to an LLC called Apex Vanguard Holdings. The bills were marked delinquent and dated back 3 years. A memory clicked into place. 3 years ago, Richard's most trusted fixer and personal accountant, a quiet, shadowy man named Parker Caldwell, had suffered a massive, fatal stroke. Richard had been frantic for months, desperately trying to untangle Parker's complex web of legal structures. Parker had been the sole manager of Apex Vanguard Holdings. When Parker died, the LLC effectively became a ghost. The tax bills went to a dead P.O. box. The city of Lowell, oblivious to the millions hidden inside, had simply followed standard bureaucratic procedure, foreclose and auction it off to recoup the $2,500 in unpaid property taxes. It was a 1,000,000,000 clerical error, and it had handed Samantha the sword to cut Richard's empire to pieces. But she couldn't do it alone. If she went to the police right now, the assets would be frozen in a federal evidence locker for a decade, and Richard's high-priced legal team would spin a narrative blaming the entire operation on the deceased Parker Caldwell. Richard would walk away clean, and Samantha would still be living in a freezing warehouse. She needed a professional. Samantha walked to the edge of the property to get cell service and dialed Susan Gable, her divorce attorney. "Sam, where have you been?" Susan's voice was laced with worry. "I've been trying to reach you. Richard's lawyers are pressing for a summary judgment. If you don't show up to the mediation on Friday, the judge is going to finalize the divorce, and you get zero. We have to fight the deep fake photos, but we need money to do it." "Cancel the mediation," Samantha said, her voice entirely devoid of the panic that had consumed her weeks ago. "And Susan, I need a name. Who is the most aggressive, ruthless forensic accountant in Massachusetts? Someone who hates corporate fraud and doesn't intimidate easily." There was a long pause on the line. "Nathaniel Harrison," Susan finally said. "He spent 15 years at the IRS Criminal Investigation Division before going private. He's brilliant, but he's notoriously picky about his clients. Why? Give me his number," Samantha commanded. "And Susan, we aren't going to fight the photos. We aren't going to fight the prenup at all. Richard is going to tear it up himself." 2 hours later, a sleek black SUV crunched over the gravel of the scrapyard driveway. A tall man in his late 50s, wearing a sharp tweed blazer and wire-rimmed glasses, stepped out. Nathaniel Nate Harrison looked around the dilapidated industrial park with deep skepticism. Samantha met him at the chain-link gate. "Mr. Harrison, thank you for coming. Susan Gable said you had something that would make my hair stand on end, Miss Hayes," Nate said, his tone dry. I charge $800 an hour, and judging by the ambiance of your residence, I'm slightly concerned about your retainer. If what I have in there is what I think it is, Samantha said, meeting his gaze evenly, you can write your own check. She led him past the mounds of trash, through the cavernous main floor, and back to the false brick wall. When she pushed open the heavy steel door and flipped on the overhead halogen lights she had rigged up, Nate Harrison stopped dead in his tracks. He stared at the pristine 1962 Ferrari. He stared at the open case of gold bullion. Finally, his eyes landed on the stack of ledgers. Slowly, Nate took off his glasses, polished them on his tie, and put them back on. He walked over to the table, pulled a pair of white cotton gloves from his briefcase, and opened the first ledger. The warehouse was silent, except for the rustle of turning pages. 10 minutes passed, then 20. When Nate finally looked up, his face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of professional awe and deep concern. "Miss Hayes," Nate breathed, his voice barely a whisper. "This isn't just tax evasion. This is systemic wire fraud on a federal scale. He's been defrauding state pension funds that invested in his developments. If the SEC or the FBI sees this, Richard Sterling will spend the rest of his natural life in federal prison, the RICO charges alone." He trailed off, looking at the gold. "You bought this building at a municipal tax auction?" "I have the quitclaim deed in my car," Samantha said. "Legally, the physical cash and gold are proceeds of crime. The government will seize them," Nate explained, pacing the concrete floor. "But the information, the whistleblower bounty from the SEC for handing over this level of documented fraud, it's typically 10 to 30% of the recovered funds. We are looking at a recovery in the hundreds of millions. Your bounty alone would make you one of the wealthiest women in Boston." "I don't care about the bounty," Samantha said coldly. "I care about Richard. I want him ruined. But first, I want my life back." "Then we need to move fast," Nate said, his demeanor shifting into a high-gear tactical mode. "The moment Richard realizes this property was auctioned off, he will send people here, dangerous people. We need to secure the ledgers and the liquid assets immediately. Do you trust the guy next door?" Samantha thought of Tom Baxter, who had brought her a thermos of hot soup just the night before. "With my life." "Good," Nate said, pulling out a burner phone. "Because we are going to need a forklift, an armored transport, and a secure bank vault. And we have exactly 24 hours to disappear this entire room." Richard Sterling sat at the head of a long mahogany table in the glass-walled boardroom of Sterling Equities, overlooking the Boston skyline. He was in a foul mood. The acquisition of a prime piece of waterfront real estate was stalling, and his new 25-year-old fiancée, Chloe, had spent the morning complaining about the size of the stone on her engagement ring. The door to the boardroom opened, and his new chief financial officer, a nervous, sweating man named Gregory Pratt, hurried in. He clutched a tablet to his chest as if it were a shield. "Richard, I need a word. In private," Gregory stammered, glancing at the other executives in the room. Richard sighed irritably, waving his hand to dismiss the room. Once they were alone, Richard fixed Gregory with a dark glare. "This better be important, Greg. I am bleeding money on the Seaport deal." "It's about Parker Caldwell's old files," Gregory said, his voice trembling. "I was doing a routine audit of the dormant shell companies, trying to clean up the back end. I checked on Apex Vanguard Holdings." Richard's blood ran cold. He stood up slowly. "And the property attached to it." "The Lowell warehouse." Gregory swallowed hard. It was seized by the city for unpaid property taxes. 3 years' worth. It went to a public foreclosure auction. "When?" Richard whispered, the color draining from his face. 3 weeks ago. It was sold." Richard grabbed the heavy crystal water pitcher from the table and hurled it against the glass wall. It shattered into 1,000 pieces, water raining down onto the plush carpet. "You're telling me," Richard roared, stepping into Gregory's personal space, "that my secure facility, the facility holding $40 million in untraceable assets and every single piece of incriminating financial data I possess, was sold for back taxes? Who bought it?" "We pulled the municipal records," Gregory squeaked, backing away. "It was purchased by a private citizen. The deed is registered to a Samantha Hayes." The name hit Richard like a physical blow to the chest. Samantha, his destitute, discarded wife. The woman he had systematically destroyed and thrown onto the streets to make room for Chloe. She hadn't just bought a warehouse, she had unknowingly bought his head on a silver platter. Or perhaps, he realized with a sickening lurch of his stomach, she did know. "Get Garrett Mills on the phone," Richard commanded, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. Now, Garrett Mills was a former private military contractor who handled Richard's more delicate corporate espionage and security issues. By midnight, Garrett and two heavily armed men were parked in a black, unmarked van at the dead end of Middlesex Street, staring at the chain-link fence of the warehouse. "All right, boys," Garrett said, checking the magazine of his suppressed sidearm. "The client says there's a false wall in the back. Break in, secure the assets, leave no trace. If the woman is there, contain her. We figure out what to do with her once we have the merchandise." They slipped out of the van, wearing night vision goggles and dark tactical gear. They cut the padlock on the front gate with hydraulic bolt cutters and moved silently across the gravel. Garrett approached the side door of the warehouse, preparing to pick the lock. Suddenly, a blinding array of industrial stadium lights blazed to life, turning the dark alleyway into broad daylight. Garrett cursed, shielding his eyes. A deafening roar split the night. It wasn't a gun. It was a massive, rusted, Caterpillar front-end loader. It smashed through the corrugated metal fencing, separating the scrapyard from the warehouse, its massive steel bucket raised high. Sitting in the cab, chewing on an unlit cigar, was Tom Baxter. Beside him in the cab, holding a pump-action shotgun resting casually out the window, was Samantha Hayes. Garrett and his men froze. This wasn't a scared, homeless woman in an abandoned building. This was an ambush. "You boys lost?" Tom's voice boomed over a crackling bullhorn wired to the tractor. "Private property. And you're trespassing in a state with very generous self-defense laws." Garrett raised his hands slowly, signaling his men to stand down. A shootout in an industrial park would bring the Lowell police in minutes, and his employer couldn't afford the scrutiny. Without a word, Garrett and his men backed away, slipped through the broken gate, and vanished into the night. Inside the cab of the tractor, Samantha lowered the shotgun, her hands shaking violently now that the immediate threat was gone. "Good work, kid," Tom grunted, putting the tractor in reverse. "They'll be back, though, with more guys, or lawyers, or cops on their payroll." "Let them come," Samantha said, her voice steadying. "The vault is empty. Nate moved everything to a private subterranean depository in Boston this afternoon. The Ferrari is sitting in a shipping container on its way to a secure storage facility in New Jersey." The next morning, Richard was pacing his office, waiting for Garrett's report. When the phone rang, he snatched it up. "It's gone." Garrett's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "The false wall was smashed open. The vault is entirely empty, swept clean. And your ex-wife has heavily armed locals running security." Richard dropped the phone. It clattered against the mahogany desk. He sank into his leather chair, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. He was exposed, utterly, completely exposed. A sharp knock on his office door made him jump. His executive assistant, Chloe, walked in holding a small, heavy cardboard box wrapped in brown paper. "This just arrived for you via private courier, Richard," Chloe said, looking annoyed. "It's extremely heavy. They insisted on a personal signature." "Leave it," Richard croaked. Once Chloe left, Richard approached the box as if it were a bomb. He took a silver letter opener and sliced the packing tape. Inside the box was a bed of packing peanuts. Nestled in the center was a single, heavy object wrapped in velvet. He pulled it out. It was a solid gold bar, stamped with a Swiss refinery logo. Beneath the gold bar was a thick manila envelope. Richard's hands trembled as he opened it. Inside was a high-resolution photocopy of page 42 of his master ledger, the exact page detailing his illegal wire transfers from the state pension fund into a Cayman Islands shell company. Clipped to the photocopy was a small handwritten note on cheap motel stationery. "You took my past. I own your future. You have 48 hours to publicly confess to the fraudulent divorce, retract the prenup, and transfer half of your legitimate, clean assets into my name." If you don't, this ledger goes to the director of the FBI, the SEC, and the Boston Globe. Checkmate. S. The silence in Richard's office was deafening. He stared at the single gold bar and the photocopy of his master ledger, his mind spinning through 100 catastrophic scenarios. For the first time in his meticulously orchestrated life, he was completely out of control. He couldn't go to the police. He couldn't go to his high-priced corporate lawyers because the very existence of the ledger proved he had been lying to them for years. He was trapped in a cage of his own making. Desperation breeds reckless decisions. Richard picked up his phone and dialed the number at the bottom of Samantha's letter. It rang twice before she answered. 48 hours, Richard. Samantha's voice was unrecognizable to him. It wasn't the soft, supportive tone he was used to, nor was it the desperate, pleading voice from the night he threw her out. It was steel. It was absolute power. "Samantha, listen to me," Richard said, forcing a calm, patronizing tone. "You don't understand what you've stumbled into. Those documents, they are highly complex corporate tax structures. If you go to the authorities, you'll implicate yourself. You were my wife during those years. You signed joint tax returns. You go to the FBI, we both go to prison." A dry, hollow laugh echoed through the receiver. "Nice try. I hired a former IRS criminal investigation agent. We've already invoked the Innocent Spouse Relief Protocol. Since you hid the assets in shell companies and manufactured a fraudulent divorce to sever my access to them, I have absolute legal immunity. You, on the other hand, are looking at 20 to 30 years. Richard gripped the edge of his mahogany desk so hard his knuckles turned white. "What do you want, Sam? Truly? 5 million? 10? I can wire it to an offshore account today. You can disappear to a private island. You don't have to live in a toxic warehouse." "I told you what I want in the letter," she replied coldly. "A public retraction of the infidelity claims, the prenup voided, half of the legitimate, clean assets of Sterling Equities transferred to me, and the Weston house." "You want the house?" Richard spat, his temper flaring. "It's a $10 million estate." "It was my home, Richard, and you threw me out of it in the freezing rain with nothing but garbage bags. Tomorrow at noon, I want the deed, the settlement papers, and the retraction signed and notarized. I'll text you the address for the meeting." "Where?" Richard demanded. "The warehouse," Samantha said. "Bring a pen." "And Richard, if Garrett or any of your private security thugs come within a mile of me, the digital dead man switch my accountant set up will automatically email the unredacted ledgers to the director of the FBI. Call Malone." The line went dead. Richard slammed the phone down. He was seething, but his panic was entirely overriding his anger. He walked out of his office, ignoring his panicked CFO, and headed straight for the elevators. When he arrived at the Weston estate, Chloe was lounging by the indoor pool, scrolling through her phone. "Richard, finally," she whined without looking up. "The caterers for the engagement party are being absolutely impossible about the champagne vintage." "Pack your bags," Richard snapped, pacing the marble floor of the pool room. Chloe froze, her phone dropping to her lap. "Excuse me? You heard me. Pack your things and go to a hotel. I have a massive corporate crisis, and I can't deal with you right now. Just get out." Chloe's face flushed red with indignation, but seeing the feral, unhinged look in Richard's eyes, she didn't argue. Within an hour, she was gone, and Richard was alone in the cavernous, silent house, pacing the floors like a caged animal, waiting for the morning. The midday sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked, weed-choked asphalt of the Lowell Industrial Park. Richard Sterling's pristine silver Mercedes G-Wagon looked absurdly out of place, a glaring beacon of wealth parked next to the rusted, jagged, corrugated metal fencing of Tom Baxter's scrapyard. Inside the climate-controlled cabin of the SUV, Richard's hands gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were stark white. He was sweating beneath the collar of his custom-tailored Tom Ford suit, a cold, clammy perspiration born entirely of panic. He glanced down at the passenger seat. Resting there was a slim, black Italian leather briefcase. Inside were the signed, notarized documents Samantha had demanded. He had spent the entire night screaming at his corporate attorneys, forcing them to draft the most humiliating concessions of his life. He had capitulated completely. He had signed away half of his legitimate, clean real estate empire. He had signed over the deed to the sprawling Weston estate. Most damning of all, he had signed a sworn, notarized affidavit confessing that the private investigator he hired had fabricated the infidelity photographs to trigger the prenup's morality clause. It was professional and personal suicide, but his survival instinct had ultimately won. The math was simple. Give up half the clean money to save his freedom. Once he had the original ledgers and the hard drives back, he would be safe from federal prison. He could rebuild, and more importantly, once the evidence was incinerated, he would dedicate the rest of his life to legally and financially destroying Samantha Hayes. He just needed to survive today. Taking a deep, stabilizing breath, Richard grabbed the briefcase, stepped out of the vehicle, and walked toward the massive, rolling bay doors of the warehouse. As he stepped over the threshold, he stopped dead in his tracks. The cavernous space had been radically transformed in just a few days. The towering mountains of rotting cardboard and shattered pallets were entirely gone. The concrete floors had been swept clean, and heavy-duty industrial floodlights illuminated the vast interior with blinding clarity. In the exact center of the massive room sat a single, heavy oak table, flanked by 2 chairs. Sitting at the table was Samantha. She wasn't wearing the damp, cheap sweaters or the faded jeans he had last seen her in. She wore a razor-sharp, tailored, navy blue power suit, her hair pulled back into a sleek, unforgiving style. She looked exactly like the formidable corporate partner she had been when they first built his company together. Standing rigidly to her right was Nate Harrison, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes calculating behind wire-rimmed glasses. Standing to her left, casually leaning his considerable weight on a heavy steel pipe wrench, was Tom Baxter, chewing on an unlit cigar. "You brought friends," Richard sneered, his voice echoing loudly off the distressed brick walls as he marched toward the table. "I thought my instructions were incredibly clear. I was supposed to come alone." "They're my witnesses," Samantha said, her voice eerily calm and devoid of the fear he was so used to hearing. "A transaction of this magnitude requires oversight. Do you have the documents?" Richard threw the leather briefcase onto the heavy oak table. The latches popped open with a sharp metallic click, revealing the thick stacks of legal paper resting inside. The updated divorce settlement, the officially voided prenuptial agreement, the quitclaim deed to the Weston property, and a signed, sworn affidavit admitting that the photographs were falsified. "It is all exactly as you demanded. Signed, sealed, and notarized this morning." Samantha didn't flinch. She reached out, pulled the thick stack of documents toward her, and slid them over to Nate. For the next 10 agonizing minutes, the only sound in the warehouse was the rustle of paper. Nate read every single page, his eyes scanning every clause, every addendum, and every legal loophole Richard's lawyers might have tried to slip in. Richard shifted his weight, his expensive leather shoes squeaking slightly on the concrete, a muscle ticking furiously in his jaw. Finally, Nate tapped the papers against the table to straighten them. He looked at Samantha and gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Everything is airtight. The concessions are absolute, and the confession regarding the manufactured infidelity is legally binding." "Excellent," Samantha said, placing her hands flat on the paperwork. She looked up at Richard, her expression unreadable. "Good," Richard snapped, extending his hand impatiently, his palm facing up. "The transaction is complete. Now, give me the ledgers. All the physical books, the offshore routing numbers, and the digital backups. Hand them over." Samantha looked at his outstretched hand, and a slow, chilling smile touched the corners of her mouth. "I don't have them." Richard's hand froze in midair. The blood instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and pale. "What did you just say?" "I said, I don't have them," Samantha repeated, her voice steady and ringing with an absolute, terrifying finality. "Did you really think I would hand back the only leverage keeping me breathing? You are a ruthless, sociopathic criminal, Richard. You launder money for shell corporations and defraud state pension funds. The very second I handed over that evidence, you would have your security contractors hunt me down. I would be found floating at the bottom of Boston Harbor before midnight." "We had a deal," Richard roared, slamming both of his fists onto the oak table so hard the wood groaned. "You lying, vindictive parasite! You gave me your word." "Do not ever talk to me about deals," Samantha cut him off, her voice cracking like a whip, echoing violently through the empty warehouse. "You stood at an altar and vowed to love and protect me for 10 years. Meanwhile, you systematically built a shadow empire, framed me for infidelity, froze my bank accounts, and threw me into the freezing rain with 3 garbage bags so you could sleep with your assistant. You do not get to invoke honor now, Richard. You forfeited that right. You want to play games?" Richard snarled, his face twisting into an ugly mask of pure rage, leaning over the table until he was inches from her face. "You think these papers mean anything? I will tie this up in civil litigation for the next 2 decades. I will bury you in so many injunctions and appeals that you will die of old age before you ever see a single dime of my money." "He is entirely correct, Miss Hayes," Nate Harrison interjected smoothly, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, his tone conversational and light. "Civil litigation against a man with his resources can drag on indefinitely, which is exactly why I heavily recommended we bypass the civil court route altogether." Richard snapped his head toward the accountant, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What the hell are you talking about?" "The Securities and Exchange Commission's whistleblower program is incredibly lucrative, Mr. Sterling," Nate explained with a tight, predatory smile. "But it requires the submission of physical, undeniable evidence. When we moved the contents of your hidden vault yesterday afternoon, we didn't take the assets to a private depository." Samantha calmly reached into the pocket of her tailored jacket and pulled out a small, black electronic remote. She pressed a single button. Behind Richard, the heavy, reinforced steel door of the disguised vault, the vault he had assumed was entirely empty, let out a loud electronic beep. The heavy locking mechanisms disengaged with a heavy clunk, and the door groaned open. Stepping out of the shadows of the hidden room were 6 individuals, 4 men and 2 women, all wearing dark navy blue windbreakers. Emblazoned across the back and front of their jackets, in bold, unmistakable yellow lettering, were 3 letters, FBI. Richard Sterling, the lead agent, said, his voice booming with absolute authority as he marched forward, a pair of heavy steel handcuffs clinking ominously in his right hand. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, aggravated tax evasion, international money laundering, and multiple violations of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act." Richard stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the concrete. His knees completely gave out, and he caught himself on the edge of the table, looking at Samantha in absolute, paralyzed horror. You turned it over? You gave them everything?" "Every last piece," Samantha confirmed, standing up slowly, towering over him metaphorically. "The gold bullion, the vacuum-sealed cash, the bearer bonds, the vintage Ferrari, and every single page of your master ledgers. We handed over an airtight case to ensure you never see the outside of a federal penitentiary for the rest of your natural life." "But the papers!" Richard screamed, his voice cracking hysterically as the federal agents grabbed his arms, forcibly twisting them behind his back. "If you turned it all into the feds, why did you make me sign the settlement? You already won the bounty." "Because," Samantha said softly, picking up the signed affidavit, confessing to the fake photographs, "the federal government only seizes the proceeds of crime. The assets you used to build Sterling equities in the early years were entirely clean. This document proves the prenuptial agreement was fraudulently enforced by you, which means, as your legal wife, I am entitled to half of what is left of your clean, legitimate empire." The heavy steel handcuffs clicked shut around Richard's wrists with a terrifying, permanent finality. "You are going to prison, Richard," Samantha said, her voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper as the agents began to drag him backward toward the door. "And the SEC whistleblower bounty I am receiving for handing over your $40 million secret stash? I am going to use it to bulldoze your precious Weston estate to the ground and turn the land into a subsidized shelter for displaced women. Checkmate." Richard's agonized screams of rage and defeat echoed violently off the high warehouse walls, growing fainter and fainter until they shoved him forcefully into the back of an unmarked federal SUV outside. Samantha stood in the profound silence of the warehouse, looking around at the massive brick walls that had once felt like a tomb. She had walked into this decaying building 3 weeks ago with absolutely nothing but a plastic garbage bag and a shattered heart. Tomorrow, she would walk out as the architect of her own destiny, armed with millions of dollars and a future that belonged entirely to her. She turned to Tom Baxter, who was grinning so widely his cigar had nearly fallen out of his mouth. "Tom," Samantha said, a genuine, radiant smile breaking across her face for the very first time in months. "Do you know any good commercial architects? We have a lot of space here, and I think I'm finally ready to renovate." Did you love this story of ultimate revenge and justice? Samantha went from sleeping in a freezing car to outsmarting a billionaire narcissist and taking back everything she deserved. It just goes to show that you should never underestimate a woman who has nothing left to lose. If this incredible story of karma catching up to Richard had you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. We want to hear from you. What would you have done if you found a secret $40 million vault hidden in an old warehouse? Let us know your master plans in the comments below. Don't forget to share this video with anyone who loves a brilliant plot twist, and subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our daily dramatic real-life stories. See you in the next video.